Welcome everyone to the final edition of this year's CompGov Command. We're going to get into the People's Republic of China. The test is tomorrow. I'm wishing everybody out there good luck who's going to take it tomorrow, and those as well who have a couple of extra days because they're taking the makeup. Still good luck to you all too. So let's go ahead and get right to it. And of course, any story of the recent political history of the PRC, you have to get into Xi Jinping, the current general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. He's the president of China from a Western perspective. We'll talk about why that isn't maybe the best moniker for him from their point of view, but it works for us because that's the word that we use for people who are head of government and head of state. And so, as he is both, it kind of is apt, but not quite from their point of view. And also important to note, one of the things that makes him the paramount leader currently is the fact that he's also the chairman of the Central Military Commission. So he holds the sort of three offices. He's the general secretary of the National Party Congress, the important of the two NPCs, and we'll explain that later. He was formally elected by the folks in the National People's Congress, which is the weaker of the two and much less relevant, and we'll explain that later. And again, the military chairperson that kind of, speaks for itself. You have to have all three of those things under your control for you to be called the paramount leader in their parlance. The CCP and the National Party Congress control everything. The state apparatus, as we're going to see when we look at Mao, was built by the CCP after their victory over the KMT and their rivals from Chiang Kai-shek, and they ejected them and forcibly exiled them to Taiwan. So it's a situation where one party creates an entire state, and the entire apparatus looks like a holographic image of how the party runs itself, right? With the situation of having a general Congress, which only has one chamber, so unicameral, right? But then out of that, you have a certain central committee of upper members that are chosen from within, so not independently elected. It's not really bicameral in that way. And then from there, they choose the Politburo, which is a common term to the Soviet Union, going back to the Russian Federation chapter. And then of those 25 members of the Politburo, only the top seven, the people called the Standing Committee. These are the seven people who really basically run a nation of over 1 billion individuals. So you can't start talking about political parties without spending the vast majority of your time talking about how the CCP works. We just mentioned the PSC, the Politburo Standing Committee. No one can ever have a chance to become the general secretary to replace Mr. Xi without being a Politburo member in the Standing Committee. It's those seven people that basically make those decisions, like I mentioned. Right now, there doesn't really seem to be anyone currently rivaling him. There was Bo Xilai for a hot minute, but then he got dinged for corruption and got sentenced to life in prison. So I guess there goes that situation. And it's important to understand that even though the National People's Congress, the weaker of the two NPCs and the more irrelevant of the two NPCs, exists, it does so mostly to essentially serve and continue to legitimize the party Congress, right? Um, Other parties are allowed to exist in China, but they're just part of that unified front, a group of individuals that have political rights on paper, but their votes and their weight of their votes will never really challenge the CCP. And in that way, the National Party Congress continues to get more and more legitimacy every time they choose a new leader, and it happens to be a high ranking member of their party and not another party. And so, like we talked about with the Russian Federation, that democratic centralism begins to sort of kick in. They never show outwardly in their meetings of the National Party Congress which happen in the fall every 5 years, they never show any disunity. It's all harmony. Individuals who've been promoted within the party, that announcement is given. These individuals raise up, everyone applauds, but everyone already knew the outcome already. There's no debate that takes place in these congresses, and that kind of goes back almost all the way back to the Confucian ethic of trying to achieve harmony, and individuals should line up underneath the ruler's guidance if the ruler is perceived to be doing a good job, right? So there certainly will be moments where members, high-ranking members of the Politburo disagree, but they'll never do that on camera. They'll never show the Chinese people they're doing that. They must show a monolithic, unified front every time that they have a Congress that's actually visible in those every 5 years where they have those moments. This being said, it's important to realize that it's been a very fraught history up to this point, and there have been some, individuals who have run the party almost into the ground. Here's looking at you, Mao, and there's other individuals who have led the party, and looking at Mr. Deng, that are essentially maybe communist in name only, really. Although maybe if you're thinking about it from a pure Marxist perspective, you can make an argument that Deng was probably a more Marxist communist than perhaps Mao was, and we'll get to that. But if we're talking about activism and social movements, obviously everyone's mind goes to 1989, June of that year in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Up to that point, from the late 70s to the late 80s, don't mind that sound. That's my dog drinking. She's a large American bulldog Scott type, and she is thirsty. But anyway, the situation was after about 10 years of slowly curated economic transformation by then paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, that eventually led some people to believe that, hey, maybe we are sort of like reforming and opening up is exactly the same policy name that Deng was using at that time. Maybe that means, maybe some political changes happening too. And no, and no. The only changes that were going to happen there were economic ones. And it was critical to the sort of regime that Deng was trying to build, where economically China could move forward and catch up to all the lost sort of economic progress that he thought that the Mao years experienced, while Mao was mired in planned economies and bungling things like the Great Leap Forward and whatnot, and purging his rivals in the Cultural Revolution. But in this instance, the party, this can only work in Deng's mind if the party remains in control. With the party firmly in control, with no political threat to the party, that's the only way all these sort of pro-capitalist sort of ideas, like the special enterprise zones and those sorts of things that he was doing to try to give folks some sort of economic growth to help raise the Chinese standard of living, and create more legitimacy for the party. That situation was never in his mind going to yield any political changes. So yes, you could make the argument, okay, so with that sort of form of openly capitalist sort of change going on, why not then introduce some form of other political expression and everything? Like, you already have a very strong Han cultural majority. Most people are going to line up behind you, Deng, anyway, because you did an economic miracle. I mean, the GDP growth from the 70s in China all the way up through recent years, from a few years ago, pre-COVID, were incredible. Were the envy of the entire globe, essentially. But remember, if you ever let any other parties in this system, as made by Mao and continued by men all the way up through Xi, if you ever allow any other party to gain any traction, then what happens is you have to change the entire fabric of government, because the state government of China was built to look just like how the party of the CCP governs itself, right? So it would cause a whole new constitution to need to be written and things like that. And that would definitely not something that was on beyond Deng's game plan at that time. Very early on, even going back to the 50s, you saw the importance of securing Western China, the Xinjiang provinces out there, and thereby also subduing individuals who happen to want to go ahead and preserve their Muslim heritage and whatnot, the Uyghurs. And you also had to go down to Tibet in the southwest of the country, grab that territory because it is the source for all of the major rivers that flow through China that water it, enable it to go ahead and feed its billion plus people. So it's critical that this link to the west in Xinjiang, which used to be on the former Silk Route, which we'll talk about, maybe a new upgraded version of that will exist at some point in the 21st century, thanks to the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, the control of all these waterways, not only for water, for agricultural purposes, but also for possibly hydropower. And we've already seen one mega project successfully completed, the Three Gorges Dam along the Yangtze, right? We might see something else where, you know, there's numbers of rivers that can be dammed, and the potential energy you can grab by creating a massive dam up at some of like the most high areas right there by the rapids. You can spin some turbines quite well and get more energy, as we know that China is the world's largest buyer of energy, and it's not close. um you get to see the idea why these two regions were so important to grab, and why anyone who dares to go ahead and talk about reverence for the culture of the Uyghurs or the Tibetan Buddhists is highly repressed. These areas must be put under control, and these regions must be Sinicized, right? Or made into or molded into the dominant Han Chinese cultural paradigm. Even more recently, other examples, you saw ever since the 2010s, you had upheaval in Hong Kong. As we remember, as of the year 1997, the UK had to turn over control into China of Hong Kong in a way that was going to be graduated over time. And as you get more and more closer to, again, like, you know, think 1997, right? So you just project 50 years to when there'll be full Chinese control, and that magic year becomes 2047. And slowly but surely, under um the two systems, one state situation, what you're going to find is that increasingly Hong Kongers feel like they're chafing more and more at the authoritarian whip of the dominant CCP government. Um, Again, this is an island off the coast that had enjoyed so much autonomy, and now all of a sudden they're finding themselves slowly akin to the allegory of the frog in the boiling water, right? That's being raised up 1 degree every few minutes. So eventually they won't know until their rights are totally cooked, and they're just basically a full-fledged part and parcel of the CCP, the same way that like Shanghai or Beijing is. Um, there also was an interesting moment during COVID where it seemed that the people of the cities were kind of really frustrated at the very harsh lockdown rules that President Xi had placed on the Chinese population. And exact figures for how many people were sickened and how many people perished because of COVID-19 there. Kind of hard to arrive at, kind of sketchy. Data flows aren't too same like we saw with the IRI, right? Data flows about people who died in certain catastrophes or protests. They're not necessarily forthcoming with that information. But yeah, no, that was a moment where individuals took great personal risk to express their displeasure about, you know, Xi's handling of the crisis. And even though there is no real challenger to him, um, it still made him seem pretty weak at the time. To the point where people were wondering, like, is he kind of losing it? Like, you know, he was on top of the world, and all of a sudden, like, it seems like his own people are rioting the streets, and then they're breaking curfews and coming outside and stuff. It was an interesting moment. The government's response to all these protests is to control information. From the people who brought you the Great Wall comes the Great Firewall, right? We're talking about some of the most exhaustive and most thorough controls over internet access and data transmission over the internet in the world, if not the greatest. And also to go with that, a massive surveillance state where closed circuit TVs are watching you, drones are flying around watching you in cities. Human individuals are watching what you're doing with your webcams, what you're doing on your live feeds and whatnot from your socials. It's pretty intense. In fact, it's to a point where they have certain levels at which they can throttle it down to. So like when the party congress meets, all of a sudden VPNs that used to work, it's like the Chinese government was like, okay, like we can let you make you think that your VPN still works, but let's go ahead and now turn off everything. So now even your VPNs don't work and things of that nature. Um, it's also starting to develop new technologies to start filtering content being sent in emails and messages and DMs between people in real time. So you might be texting a message to someone about something kind of political, and by the time it gets to that person, a few moments later, the message has been either completely deleted or changed to something different. If you persist and you continue to try to publish things and notions that are against the CCP's will, oh yeah, you will get detained. And if you do it in certain regions, such as Tibet and the Xinjiang province, you might be re-educated. That's the thing that happens there. So understand this: despite the iron technological and physical fists from running people over with tanks in Tiananmen, all the way now to changing your text before it even gets to the next person you're trying to send a message to, people are still people. People are still going to sort of, want to express themselves. People are still going to want to find like-minded individuals and discuss matters that are important to them. So activism still happens there. It's just a matter that when it does happen, it's very tightly controlled, and then it's not allowed to grow into larger. And so if people are protesting in different regions, they're not allowed to coalesce into a national movement. So they're kept fragmented. And then in these isolated pockets, they're heavily suppressed until people just give in. I always show a documentary to my students about people in Tibet asking Tibetan lamas who their spiritual leader is. And so you think, okay, maybe he might say the Dalai Lama, but they always very politely bow and say Xi Jinping, because they understand that they would prefer to live in their monastery and not live in a jail cell. This is a unitary one party state. As we mentioned, the CCP allows the state to exist as it does. They could change it. I mean, I think at any given time, if they wanted to, the National Party Congress could abolish the People's Congress in a crisis. They probably could. But it's cool optics right now to make it seem like everything is on the up and up, right? After all, it's the People's Republic, the PRC, right? So Republic, again, three first letters, REP for representatives, right? So individuals are indirectly chosen to sit in this People's Congress to get the feel of, oh yeah, we our ideas are heard, we have voice in this government, only to then realize that, okay, all of that stuff in the People's Congress leads to a minor figure known as the premier, who doesn't even really have much policy sway, really. Kind of akin to what the prime minister is like in the Russian Federation compared to Putin as the president. Cool sounding title, but it sounds pretty cool to call yourself the premier of the People's Republic of China. And Mr. Lee, I'm sure, is very proud of himself. He's also, I'm sure, a very loyal party member, and he will do whatever it needs to do to perpetuate the success of the CCP. And that way, it's kind of like a party state system or a one party state system. I already kind of like gave Mao his roses, so to speak, in the form of kind of dissing him as an economist. But we talked about this, didn't we, last time with Iran, about how firm ideologues don't make the best economic leaders. They just don't. They're so focused on, in his case, first Leninist Stalinist doctrine of communism, and then later on his own special spin on that. But in the end, he drove the economy into the ground. Um, That's all there is to it. I talk to my college students occasionally, and I always ask them this question before we get to China: which of these two men is more influential in Chinese history? And everyone says, "Well, you have to say Mao because he built the party and so on." But I'm like, "Well, but then the other kids say, but the people were horribly miserable during his time compared to how incredibly successful they've been during Deng." And Deng, during his tenure, he didn't actually go ahead and have people, wearing dunce caps and stuff, and purged, and individuals sent off to go live in the countryside to learn the way of the proletariat and everything. Um, you don't get the modern China that we know today without Deng. And I would argue that that switch from that backwards sort of totalitarian, complete command economy China of Mao to Deng's China altered human history forevermore. Unleashed an economic juggernaut that we've never seen on this planet before. And part of that was due to his embrace of opening up the economy, liberalizing the economy, and allowing for some sectors of the country to get involved with owning private property, and then thereby reintroducing the profit motive back into the Chinese economy. He starts off with special little enterprise zones or economic zones, and it eventually grows out. And these things become more productive at first than the old state-owned enterprises, the old collectivized enterprises. But and as more foreign actors bring their inventions, bring their intellectual property into country, and Chinese workers get to work on these sort of industrialized goods and these workflows, and they learn these productivity methods and improve upon them, and then use their lower cost of labor, and then use their material advantage in having such great natural resource wealth in country as well, and such liberal government subsidies. What you find is that they hand over to Xi a fantastic economy with strong party discipline. And that's what makes Xi so interesting. Xi he's a perfect crossroads between these two. He comes into prominence in the party as a low-level party worker devoted to the squad as he moves through his, I would say like his 20s, 30s, maybe more like his 30s, 40s. And then he emerges as a possible member of the Central Committee right at a time when the Chinese economy is exploding. Now, him personally, his father was a long marcher who went through that whole heroic hero's sort of journey arc of Mao when he was first losing to Chiang Kai-shek, and then he had to go to the countryside and rally people and get them to help him fight against the Japanese first, and then pivot to fight against Chiang, right, after his troops leveled up and he wins the Civil War and everything. So with his dad being essentially one of the people that Mao trusted as an individual who was inside the party ever since his darkest days, it's interesting to think then all of a sudden that he ends up in the Cultural Revolution purging his father and sending him off to go live with the proles at a pig farm for like a decade before he's allowed to, having paid his dues, to come back and start working his way up. So he has a feel for what it's like to have personal connection to Mao, and so some of the old guard likes him a lot. And he also was around for some of the economic reforms. He understands the importance of economic growth to preserve the CCP's legitimacy, right? So he's an interesting blend of the two different lineages, right? Kind of a hybrid of sorts. And because he's got these Maoist ties, he's all about firm central control of the party. And he's all about sort of, making sure that the party remains pristine in people's eyes by rooting out corrupt members inside of it. Like we talked about the arrest, well, the capture and the arrest of, and the indictment of Bo Xilai. Um, and he's really kind of leaning into the tech thing too. As part of his Made in China sort of 2025 initiative, he really wants to keep pushing these high tech industries in order to go ahead and make sure that these technologies involving drones involving artificial intelligence, can very much serve as strong sort of boosts to augment the Great Firewall already and keep that firm control by the party. When it comes down to it, you add up all three of these men's legacies, you didn't really have much economic reform positively. Mao tried, but it was central planned economy stuff that wasn't going to work in the first place. But when you look in what Deng started and what now Xi is continuing, economic reforms are far more important to these men than political reforms. Again, this is a no-brainer. The CCP runs everything. Um, One of the key offshoots of the Central Committee of the National Party Congress is that Central Military Commission and control over the People's Liberation Army, who still occupies that same name because that name has great historical lore, right? And the PLA is still, I think, the largest military on earth. They're really getting into such fun things now as like hypersonic missiles, drone technology. The Chinese Navy is growing exponentially as they become the premier shipbuilders in the world right now. And having Xi be the military chairperson only further centralizes all power within the CCP. Some nations have situations where military generals occupy sort of power niches apart from civilian leadership. But no, civilian leadership in this case has very much captured military leadership. And most recently, there was a major purge by Xi of a lot of generals. And I don't really know why exactly. I wonder if it has something to do with plans to possibly invade Taiwan, or he just feels like it's time to get a whole new crop of generals because these guys were getting old and they started having their own ideas. I don't know what that is, but Xi even more recently, like tightened his grip over the military with these purges of these generals. I got to mention Chiang Kai-shek because you don't get an ROC, a Republic of China, across the water in Taiwan without him and his forces sort of like licking their wounds and leaving to go set up there. And that basically begins an interesting situation in which if you do have some sort of reunion, a reunification of the two, it could be because maybe the KMT, which is a party that still exists, you might see it spelled DMT in some places, but you know, I was always taught with it being KMT. You might see them at some point winning some elections in Taiwan, and they're open to possibly maybe they're the more conservative of the two major parties aside from the DPP in Taiwan. But um, there is a small sliver of the KMT allowed to continue to exist in the National People's Congress on the mainland. So there could be a political, very weak, very tenuous political link, but it's possible that if there was another party allowed to exist, kind of, maybe as a reminder of who the CCP defeated, it could be the KMT if they were allowed to have something akin to like what the Communist Party has in the Russian Federation, between 8 to 10% of the vote, having a very thin minority that can never do anything to gain any real power. It could be a cool flex for the CCP just to be like, oh, we are so magnanimous that we're allowing the KMT to be a thing again. And we're using that as an olive branch to try to bring Taiwan back into the fold. But I don't think we'll ever see that in our lifetime. Um, we see Mao, the man who destroyed Chang's aspirations of uniting all of China on the mainland under the nationalist banner. Um, he's the founder of the People's Republic based on the blueprint laid down by his party. Um, Two major gaffes on his part: the Great Leap Forward, which killed tens of millions of people, messed up the entire demographic future because trying to recover from that massive loss of life. Later on in his late phase, in the early 70s, they went ahead and embarked on the architecture that would eventually become the one child policy, and that was highly fraught. Um, and no one thought maybe that was a bad idea, and maybe no one thought to try to say, Mao, we shouldn't do that, because he'd purged all the moderates who would probably try to oppose him. And so again, that was another moment that changed human history. What would China be like right now if they hadn't purged those moderate thinkers and actually had stopped the one child policy and didn't tilt so heavily into a demographic disaster as they've done now? um I don't know, but all I know is that thankfully during the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping is able to convince Mao to let him live. His apology was sufficient, I guess. And him being a pretty bright guy, but still very committed to the party. Maybe the rationale was like, look, man, I'm not trying to stop the CCP from doing great things. Like I'm just as deep in the game of the party as you, Mao, but economically, I got some better ideas than you. Just let me cook. Um, Especially when you think about the idea that he's, like I said before, Marx always said a true communist nation would only be formed if a country went through all stages of capitalism, then went through all stages of socialism, then finally one day people looked around and realized, wait a second, like we're all relatively equal, we all have a high standard of living. There's no real disputes among us anymore. Like, what are we doing? Like, we should just dissolve government and just live together as in communities, right? Then boom, next thing you know, communism. Um, and to push that, the economic reforms, he was very much into the four modernizations when he began to get more say over economic policy in the party. And that's, of course, working on agriculture, right? Got to feed all these, billion plus Chinese. You need to also go ahead and work on Mao's goal, which was to boost industry, but do it in a more efficient way. These backyard furnaces to make steel aren't going to work. We need actual real, foundries, and we need real factories, Western style. And so we need to learn how to do that. We might have to import some and then figure it out as we work there and whatever. Um, Got to get that science up, especially in terms of things like engineering, chemistry, those sorts of things. Social science, not so much, as we see with the blundering of the one child policy. Anybody with basic knowledge of social studies would have seen that that was pretty fraught, but oh well. Those intellectuals got purged, but individuals in the STEM field were still around. And the last one, the modernizations being the military. There's a very famous video of some archive footage of the Chinese doing military testing of nuclear weapons, which they acquired in the 1960s, and putting gas masks on soldiers and gas masks on cavalry units on horses. Uh, Kind of a weird juxtaposition of technologies there. Um, and of course, we see Xi. He now serves as a unification of all of Mao's ideals and all of Deng's ideals, and he's unopposed right now. Um, COVID kind of threw him for a loop, but he recovered nicely from that. And now the next big challenge for him is going to be how to deal with one of his main energy partners, Iran, being economically strangled by his main geopolitical rival across the Pacific Ocean, the United States. I don't know how that's going to work. At some point, despite all the green tech that abounds in China, despite all the nuclear reactors that they have, and of course the Three Gorges Dam, which is the most powerful hydro dam on the planet, they're going to need some sort of new crude oil. And Russia can give them some over, pipelines and stuff, but Iran was one of their main sort of sources, one of the main producers. Something's going to give soon. You keep an eye on Xi in the next few months, as if I don't know if the Chinese Navy is going to get involved. I can't tell, but that's something's going to have to go ahead and have to yield there, because he cannot let, and this is something we talked about a lot of authoritarian regimes. One of the ways authoritarian regimes begin to lose legitimacy for the few people that do support it without being coerced by force to do it is they provide economic uplift. If you don't provide any economic uplift anymore and you're President Xi, you might find all of a sudden rivals come out of the woodwork coming after you. Here are your main themes. The CCP is firmly in control. There's no question. It's not really the fact that anything else exists. So you really can't call it a dominant party system, because the other parties in the United Front or whatever, they only have access to decisions made by the People's Congress, which is like the weaker of the two, right? Again, we talked about the importance of economic growth. The moment the economy lags, Xi's in trouble. We talked about the importance of maintaining those two critical regions and establishing sort of a hegemony of Han cultural dominance over the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and over the people of Tibet. Then we also talked about the idea that they allow some modicum of expression, but the moment you start violating secret speech and start saying things you can't even talk about, I'm sure your teachers probably mentioned the Winnie the Pooh thing to you, then you're in trouble. And you very quickly, they can identify who you are, what you said. People in Hong Kong who are protesting took great pains to cover their face, lest they be seen by a drone camera or by CCTV, then be isolated by the authorities and arrested. And all of this is done under the auspices of making China dynastic again, right? The idea that the China dream of Xi is to make China so strong it harkens back to their old days in the Han dynasty or something else like the Tang dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the early years of the Qing, right? Where, they were a global power. And if you think about it, for most of human recorded history, a Chinese dynasty has been one of, if not the foremost nation state on the planet. So this aberrant time in which the Qing died, and all of a sudden, like Europe and other parts of the world rose up, like North America. That's like, these are blips in human history. Remember, history goes back to everything that's recorded and written down on paper, right? Everything else before paper and writing things down on papyrus or cuneiform tablets with all that sort of stuff. That's prehistory. And even then, we go back before the Shang dynasty in China to the Jia dynasty, and who knows? They could have been subsequent dynasties before that. But long story short, Xi is looking to go ahead and try to get back to that level, and he wants to go ahead and make sure all Chinese are sold on that same dream, his China dream. Yeah, the authoritarian piece they might bring up. They might bring up the legitimacy angle for the economic stuff. They might compare and contrast how Iran and China deal with dissension among people for political discussion and whatnot in civil society. There are the key words right there. Here's your main takeaway. China has a one-party authoritarian system that maintains control through economic performance, nationalism, and suppression of political and social dissent. So with that, we are donezo with China. And again, thank you for taking the time to listen. I wish you all great luck on the test. You'll do great. And if you don't do great, the Chinese government will find out and they'll come arrest you. No, just kidding. No, just do your best, though. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.